Hey everyone, how are you? How's everyone feeling? Coffeeed up?
Good.
Caffeine? Good, good. See a lot of familiar faces in here. We used to live in Jakarta for almost 10 years. We're now in Singapore, but we're glad to be back. Today we don't want it to feel like a session or a talk per se. It's just a sharing of what we've learned, haven't learned, what we've done well, what we haven't done well in terms of spiritual disciplines. So I guess I want to start with kind of a caveat. I know the word discipline can have a negative connotation, something that feels strict or harsh or legalistic, but I want to set the stage for what we mean when we say discipline. Now, discipline actually has the same root word as disciple, as you can see, kind of even just in the spelling. And so, as Jesus has called us to be his disciples or his followers, what we come to think of as a discipline is just a way to live as a disciple or follower of Jesus. It's that simple. It's nothing weird or checking the box. So the discipline is just a way of life of being a disciple of Jesus. And so whether we like it or not, we all actually have disciplines or habits, good or bad. Sometimes we're following Jesus, sometimes we're following something else. So we all have disciplines. And so the question is then, what does it mean to actually follow Jesus? Now, a little bit about both of our stories. Marissa and I both grew up in Christian homes, or homes with Christian parents, and grew up in the church and had our fair share of disciplines in our home, reading scripture, praying. But we each had our own struggles, falling away from the faith, or kind of wrestling through it personally. And so we don't come talking about disciplines as like people who have figured it out or have never had issues with faith. We're coming at this as people who have rediscovered faith, wrestled through it, struggled through it, have done certain disciplines well, haven't done others well. And so, yeah. So I just want to frame what the importance of disciplines or the importance of a certain way of life. So I think if I asked people in this room or asked most Christians, what does it mean to be a Christian? Define a Christian. I think a lot of people would say, oh, it means you believe in God, or you believe in Jesus, or even better, maybe you believe or trust him, or you even obey him when you ask him what to do, when you pray. Now, all those things are great, but I actually believe that's not the answer. That's very incomplete. When Jesus said, follow me, it actually meant something that was very committal, very life-changing. And so to give a bit of a background, when Jesus said, follow me, now a little bit of historical context, in first century Israel, discipleship, what that meant to follow a rabbi or a teacher was a 24/7 way of life. You slept, you ate, you went around, you worked, you followed your teacher all day with 3 goals in mind. And those 3 goals were to be with your teacher, to become like him, and then to live as he did. So to be with your teacher, there was actually a saying in first century Israel that, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. And they literally meant that because the way of following a teacher, you would walk so closely beside him that he would kick up his dust on you. And that was actually a sign of blessing. The second goal of becoming like your teacher, there's a verse we all know in the Bible where Jesus says to Peter, I will make you a fisher of men. Now, that actually wasn't just a little pun. It's actually kind of lost in translation. Back in that day, they actually called all the greatest rabbis fishers of men. That was something you called the greatest rabbis. And they called them that because, like catching a fish, the greatest rabbis would catch your mind. They would catch your imagination. They would captivate you. And so going on to the third goal, the ultimate goal of being with your teacher and becoming like him wasn't just to believe in him or believe that, yes, he exists or he's good or I can trust him. All good things, but not enough. You were actually trying to live as he lived, day to day, 24/7. So we want to explore that to follow Jesus and take up his cross, when he says to follow him, means to order and structure our lives to actually live like Jesus lived, day to day. And I think we all know this, right? Jesus is not a body of knowledge or something just to be known, although that's important. We do know him. But he's a person, and he lived a certain way of life, and he calls us to follow that way of life. So today, what we want to talk to you about are 5 disciplines. They all start with S to make it easy. Of course, there are probably more spiritual disciplines. We owe a lot of this work. This is I'd love to claim this, but it's not my work. It's actually explored really well by John Mark Comer in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. So we have a recommendation at the end. You can look more into that. But the 5 spiritual disciplines, the 5 S's we want to talk to you about today are slowing, service, silence and solitude, Sabbath, and simplicity. And now the context of what these disciplines are actually trying to combat is very relevant in today's age. So in today's modern age, where we're all always connected to any information, anyone, anywhere, anytime, the enemy I think we all have to face is this concept of hurry. And so there's a story that John Ortberg, his mentor was Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard was a big American philosopher, theologian, and he asked Dallas, I want to be a godly man. How do I become all that God wants me to be? And he said, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And John Ortberg thought that was cool, but he said, okay, well, what else do I have to do? And Dallas actually said, nothing. That's it. Hurry is the greatest enemy of spiritual life in our modern day. So you might ask, well, what is hurry? What do you mean by hurry? Maybe in Jakarta we feel like, well, I can't really hurry that much. I can't get anywhere fast, right? Macet and all that. But hurry, more kind of broadly defined, is just a rush to do, achieve, accumulate, get through lists, feel productive, maximize time, even to do good things as quickly as possible. Be good parents, be good Christians. Hurry is this, even not just a physical sense of rush, but a mental or spiritual sense of always having to do and achieve. Now, there's a big, I think in business and entrepreneurship in general, there's been a big hustle culture. They call it the grind. People even kind of praise it. It's crept into the church. It's crept into Christian business leaders and startup founders. But funny enough, even the secular world is even pushing back now. There's an anti-hustle movement. People will actually call out when guys are posting, or even ladies are posting on Instagram that they woke up early and worked, this much by 5 a.m. A lot of people actually label that hustle porn. They say, stop glorifying this unsustainable, my life is all that all I do is my life, sort of way of life. So what we want to submit is that it's not accidental that when Paul is defining love in 1 Corinthians 13, he actually says the first trait of love is patience. It's something that's slow. It's something that's waiting. And I think we all know this, right? It's very hard to love others, which is the greatest commandment Jesus gave us, if we're rushing. And so hurry is actually antithetical to love. And I think we all know this, right? When you're trying to get out the door, especially those with young kids, it's been 30 minutes, you're still trying to get out the door. That's probably not the moment when you're going to be the most loving. You're going to snap, you're going to say something wrong, you're going to tell your child to stop asking why for the 7th time really aggressively. So that's why we think hurry is very antithetical to love. So we want to explore the 5 spiritual disciplines, and I'll let Marissa start with slowing.
Thanks, Jared. That was a great introduction. So the first practice is slowing that we'd like to talk about. And there's a famous theologian who's known for saying that that wisdom, and we're talking about wisdom today, wisdom is about knowing God and about knowing yourself. And the thing about slowing is that when we actually slow down, we actually have a chance to get to know our God and ourselves a bit better. Corrie ten Boom interestingly said, if the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. And so I think what she's getting at is that sin and busyness can actually have very similar effects. Busyness, even if you're doing it for good, godly things, can sometimes actually separate us from God. They can sometimes disconnect us from other people, from our loved ones, our families, even from ourselves and our own souls. And so busyness is interesting because it can be just as bad as extreme sin, but extreme sin is more obvious, right? If you murder someone or if you steal something, people around you will probably say, hey, that's not a good idea or that's really bad. But if you're busy, it's like, well, that's kind of cool sometimes. A lot of times people will say, oh, how are you? And they'll say, oh, I'm busy, as in if this is a good thing. I just have a lot of things to do. I'm very productive. I'm just doing great things. Sometimes it's even for God's kingdom. But if we really think about the heart of busyness, it can often draw us away from God. There's another really great author called C.S. Lewis, and he wrote this book called The Screw Tape Letters, and it's about this senior demon writing to a junior demon, and he's kind of giving him advice on how to lure humans away from God and towards themselves or towards sin. And he says, murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. So this idea of sometimes busyness can just kind of slowly draw us away from what should be our original love, what should be, from Jesus, who should be our true heart desire. So what is the antidote to busyness? Well, we would say one antidote is slowing. John Ortberg, who Jared talked about, has defined the practice of slowing as cultivating patience by deliberately choosing to place ourselves in positions where we simply have to wait. So like Jared referenced, actually Jakarta can be the matcha, so maybe you take the slowest way on Google Maps instead of the fastest way, and you say, okay, I'm just gonna slow down, take a few more moments to pray before my meeting. That's maybe one way that we can intentionally slow ourselves down. We live in Singapore now. We used to live in New York. We were just talking to Raina about how New Yorkers walk very fast. But these are things that I think I also love walking fast. And now that we have 2 little kids, it's like, oh my goodness, we are walking at like a snail pace. And yet there can be such a joy in that. Our kids, we have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and our 1-year-old will just kind of look at the grass and look at the birds and the flowers, and everything is just so interesting. But he's just being so present. He's being really present with God's creation. He's being present with the details, and there's something so humbling about that, and something that we actually learn. Another thing that our 1-year-old does is he's really into waving right now. So he'll wave at a lot of people. He might wave to some of you. He's just outside. But he'll sometimes wave at the people cleaning the toilets, who Jared and I just walk by. The people taking out the trash, and he'll wave at them, and he'll smile, and then they'll smile back, and we're like, oh, wow, we just walked by that person. But our 1-year-old was present enough to actually acknowledge this other person who's also made in the image of God. And so there's, they're moving at a slow pace, but they're able to really, I think, kind of embody and almost be, in some ways, the kind of people that we would like to become. And so another practice that Jared has actually done well to slow down is fasting. So I haven't done this as well, I'm not so great in this department, but when you fast, you actually slow down your body, you slow down your mind, and you slow down your soul. And this is something that, Christians here in Jakarta, I think we can learn a lot from our Muslim brothers and sisters. They do this every year very, very diligently for 30 days. And yes, maybe sometimes not always for the right reasons, but I think God can work even with the motives that aren't perfect in our lives. Even if we have kind of poor motives for doing things, he can still work with that and meet us in those times. So Jared has actually done this practice with a friend named Tim in the back. So you can ask either of them about this, but they've even sometimes done it on a weekly basis and just said, okay, let's pray together and let's fast today. And so that's been really cool. I think they've encountered God in different ways through that. Let's see. So I just want to leave you with Matthew 18 here. So coming back to this idea of the little baby who's present, Jesus actually says that we should be like little children. And he says, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of God. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So, I think if you, for those of you who do have the little kids, just enjoy those slow moments. Enjoy just, just being present in the little things. So we'd like to move now to the second practice, service. Again, this is a practice that I would say Jared and I are probably not that great at. Our family is not that great at really building this into our lives. It's something that we want to grow in, we want to be more intentional about. So all of you check in with us in a few months or in a year and see how we're doing. But Jesus, I think, when you look at his life, and there's a really great series called The Chosen, if you haven't seen it yet, I think it depicts visually what the kind of life that Jesus actually lived and how he reached out to people that were not like him. He reached out to the poor, to the outcasts, people who were lepers, people who were demon-possessed. people who didn't have a name or a reputation. And he really reached out to them. And I think Jessica in her talk earlier did a really nice job of talking about how the little things, the no-name, non-important things can sometimes be really honoring to God and really beautiful in his sight. And so the story of her grandmother I just loved, of how she would serve people in small ways in the early morning and late at night, and that can sometimes really honor our Lord. So Jesus, he talks about this a little bit in Luke, where he says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't just invite your friends, your brothers and your sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they might invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, invite the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And so, I have to say, within this community of people, certainly within the Resource Global community, there are a lot of people who have devoted their vocations to serving the poor, serving people who don't have great medical care, serving the refugees in this city, and just doing really awesome work, and also helping to combat human trafficking in this region. So I think there are people who we can learn from. We're not the greatest, but there are other people here who can learn from them about what it looks like to really live a life of service. But when you look at this scripture, I think what's interesting is that, when Jared and I reflect on the kind of dinners that we go to, and we live in Singapore, it's a little bit of a self-selecting kind of place, isn't it? I mean, because you'll have these like dinners, sometimes they're ministry dinners, and you realize like, oh wow, everybody there is like really well-to-do. They have nice cars, nice things, nice educations, nice, everything is really great. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But then we think about, okay, well, how many times do we have dinner with the cleaning staff at our apartment complex, or, just other people? I mean, I don't know that we do that. We don't reach out. And so that's something that it can be a little awkward. It can be a little hard to think through, okay, how do we do that, especially since maybe, they're not people that we are used to interacting with. But what does it look like to reach out like Jesus did? So that's something that we're working on. Let's see, in Matthew 20, the mother of James and John, she actually, these are two of Jesus' disciples, and she says to Jesus, she says, how do my sons be great? How do they sit at your right and your left? And Jesus says to her, actually, you still don't have this idea of what it looks like to be great in my kingdom. What it looks like to be great in my kingdom is very different. And he says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus says the greatest thing to do is actually to serve. And we shouldn't be following this world model of seeking power and seeking greatness and seeking status and reputation. And I know it's hard, because I think certainly those things, for many of us, these are things that have enabled us to actually do things for God's kingdom or connect with other people. And so there's not necessarily something bad in that. But I think we just have to ask ourselves, are we finding our joy in that? Are we finding our identity? Are we finding our source of meaning in our resume or in our accolades? I think those are just questions to ponder as we reflect. Let's see. So another convicting question we can, ask ourselves is well, this is an interesting one. Is when we give. So we're called to give to different ministries, and Jesus says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And yet we see sometimes that, there are placards of who donated what, or a building. Jared went to a school where there's building, or even my school, my university, there's this building is after this person, the Tisch Library, or, it's always got someone's name on it. And I think maybe there's not necessarily something wrong in that, although we could debate that after over coffee. But I think the question is, why are we giving so that other people can see, the great things that we're doing, or are we doing this in service to the Lord? And so probably a good practice is to be a little bit like Jessica's grandmother and do the things that nobody will notice, that nobody might ever find out about. Maybe it's giving a little gift. Actually, Jessie, who's in the room, I remember she used to, she would sometimes like make these little paper hearts and just give them to the doorman, or to the janitor. It might be something small like that nobody will know about. Nobody will really give you an award for. But Jesus sees those small acts of service and love. So the third practice we'd like to talk about is silence and solitude. And Microsoft, a company you all know, did a survey, and they found that for 77% of young adults, when nothing is happening, the first thing they do is reach for their phone. And so I know for all of us, it's I think especially in Jakarta, it's important to always be on WhatsApp and connected, and maybe you need to order, lunch on Grab, or order, figure out your next thing. And so it's hard to not reach for your phone. But I think the question is, when we have these moments of, I don't know what to do, are we turning to God, or are we turning to noise? Are we turning to Jesus, or are we turning to the distractions in our life? And we can certainly invite God into those things. Hey, God, what do you think about me having this nasi goreng for lunch? Or what do you think about, me going to this dinner later tonight? I mean, we can invite him into those moments. Actually, we did the Crown study with the Suparnos several years ago. And I remember one takeaway was, when you're going to buy something, just consult God. This is a kind of a nice handbag. Should I buy that, God, or should I wait? And so I think we can invite God into those moments. But I think the question is, are we taking time to actually sit and be still? Now, the hard thing about silence and solitude is that oftentimes it's seen as let's do this annual silent retreat, or let's go to this place, let's go to the mountains, get away. And that's great, and there's nothing wrong in that. I think we should do those things. But I think the question is, how do we actually build silence and solitude into our daily life so that it becomes a part of our daily posture? And the goal here is really to meditate, to listen to God, to hear from him. And a lot of Christians will do this. They'll have quiet time, but even for me, it's I want music in the background, or maybe I want to go to a cafe, or I'd rather pray in a small group rather than pray on my own. And I still struggle with these things. But, the thing is, when we sit alone with God, it can be sometimes a very different experience. It can be very uncomfortable. I remember one pastor said, it's sort of like if maybe in Jakarta you might have a driver, or you're riding in a taxi or a Gojek. But let's say you go to Australia or America, and you're in college, and you're rushing to class. So you have, every day. So you've got McDonald's in the back, and Starbucks cups, and empty water bottles, and you're driving, and then you slam on the brakes, and suddenly all the junk comes to the front. It's all in your in your windshield, in your dashboard. And then you're oh, wow, that's a lot of junk in my car. And that's kind of what slowing down with silence and solitude can be like. You suddenly see all this junk in your life, and it can be a little overwhelming, but the beautiful thing is that Jesus really meets us in those times. And so having this relationship with God is important, being still and knowing that he is God. All right, we'll pass it off to Jared for the fourth practice.
Thank you. So so that was the first three. There are two more. I'll try to land the plane here. The fourth one is Sabbath, and we've had an interesting journey with that, which I'll get to. But I wanted to first frame it just looking at the Ten Commandments. So what's interesting is, as I read through the list of 10 Commandments several times, there's kind of one thing that stuck out to me, which is that every single command is very simple and short, except two of them: the command not to worship other idols and the commandment to Sabbath. I find that interesting because the commandment to keep the Sabbath doesn't just say, do not fail to keep the Sabbath. It also has clarification, justification on why you should take the Sabbath, instruction on how to take the Sabbath, and a reference to Genesis. So it's the longest commandment, and as I read through that, I kind of thought, it seems like to me the commands, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery, these were all obvious. There's kind of nothing else that needs to be said. But when it comes to taking a Sabbath rest, it's as if the Israelites, and even us still today, we need extra reasons. We need extra help. We all know it's easy not to kill someone. That shouldn't be done. But when it comes to Sabbath, and interestingly, I think the failure to Sabbath is an idolatry of work or self. When it comes to those two commandments, God makes it extra clear, extra long. So I find that very interesting. So now going into the Sabbath, I think the purpose is twofold. One is to cease, the second is to celebrate. Now what we mean by ceasing is ceasing from this kind of relentless wheel that's always ongoing to accomplish or achieve or accumulate, to cease from work and to simply rest, whatever that looks like. That's kind of the negative framing of it, to cease from those things, to not do those things. But then, the Sabbath is not just a day where we kind of don't do anything and sit around. It's actually positively a day to celebrate, to be full of gratitude, to be full of joy, to enjoy God's gifts, to enjoy his creation, to enjoy each other, to enjoy family, friends, good food. And so those kind of two purposes frame what the Sabbath is. And it's interesting if we think about our whole lives. Let's say we live 70 years. If we actually Sabbathed one day out of every 7, that means we would spend a decade of our lives doing nothing. Just enjoying being with each other, eating, sleeping more, napping. Now that sounds horrible, right? But actually I think in God's kingdom, in a flourishing life, it sounds awesome. And that's very countercultural, right? But I actually think we're wired to rest. It's actually a law of biology. So you can try to break it. Eventually it'll break you, one way or another. We actually see evidence of the health of living in Sabbath physically. So there was a doctor cited in John Mark Comer's book. He did a survey of people all around America, and he found that some of the happiest people were Seventh-day Adventists. Now, for those of you who don't know, Seventh-day Adventists are Christians, but they take the Sabbath very seriously, religiously. Some would even say maybe a little bit legalistically, but they do Sabbath every week very religiously. And the stat that turns out is that they actually live 10 years longer than the average American. So you actually start to see just longer lifespans from this practice of resting, of really taking it seriously. And we've had an interesting experience with Sabbath. So as Marissa mentioned, we started watching The Chosen, as I think a lot of people did during COVID. Kind of depicts Jesus and the life of his disciples. And one of the first episodes there, it depicts this Shabbat Jewish dinner where they invite everyone in from the neighborhood, come in, they say a prayer, they kind of have a ritual, they move slowly through dinner, and it's a way to invite in the Sabbath. And with our friend, again, Tim in the back, we started doing this during COVID, but we started during Singapore when you couldn't even have one person over to your house. It was locked down. So we were doing it on Zoom. And then as soon as the restrictions lifted, we started having people over. But almost every week now for almost 3 years, we've invited Christians, non-Christians into our home. And we actually kind of go through the Jewish Shabbat program. And it's not legalistic. It's not weird. I actually find it, as a Christian, very centering. So it's pretty simple. You light some candles, you bless God with a song, you have a worship song, you bless your children, you bless everyone else, the adults, you bless the wine, you bless the bread. And it's a way to usher in Sabbath. And so what we've actually experienced is that Sabbath is not just a day to kind of rest or to not work, but it's actually a posture that we should bring Monday through Saturday. So what is that posture? Now, I think it's a posture toward work, that work is not necessarily all up to us and it's not all important. So we know that we are not working for our salvation. We're already saved. In fact, in Ephesians 1, we are told that we've already been blessed with all riches and spiritual blessings. So we're not working to gain more. That's not what we should be working for. We also know we're not working for our identity. In Ephesians 5, it tells us we're already children of God. So we know who we are. We shouldn't be working for that. We're also not working to achieve or accumulate. Jesus told us, he warned us in Luke 12 to watch out. He said, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A life does not consist in abundance of possessions. So I think Sabbath is not just something we want to kind of have a posture of rest and think about work correctly just on Sunday. It's something to kind of center ourselves so that we bring that posture toward work Monday through Saturday, the rest of the days. The last spiritual discipline we want to get to is simplicity. Now, it might sound weird. What does simplicity mean? So there's a definition that Richard Foster, another theologian, put out, which is simplicity is a lifestyle of choosing to leverage our time, our talents, our treasure toward what matters most. Now, I think a lot of us, Christians included, but the kind of the worldly culture is that we actually have it backwards. We use what matters most. We use people, we use relationships, we even use God to get more money or more talent or more self-actualization, more treasure. So what we want to do is the practice, how do you actually live the simplistic life? I think there's kind of two main buckets to think about. One is material simplicity, the other is mental simplicity. So in terms of material simplicity, Marissa kind of already started touching on that. Even the secular world has caught on to this, right? This whole movement of minimalism. Now, what's interesting to me is that I think Christians should be the most minimalist because we already know we have an eternal inheritance. We already know like more than we could ever imagine is already stored up. So we should be able to live with so much less. And so what Marissa was saying is perhaps before we buy that next thing, we should consult God. And I think one thing to also think about is not just the monetary cost of something. Usually the biggest cost to buying an item is the time cost. So things don't just take our time, they don't just take our money. They need replacing, or when they break, then we go on Shopee to find a new one, or it ruins our whole morning when when it's broken, or it gets sad, or it's so nice and it gets a stain on it. So all of this cost is mental cost, emotional cost, time cost. All that time that could just be spent enjoying what's already in front of us, we're using to replace something that we didn't even need in the first place. So I think thinking about not just the monetary cost of things, but time cost. You can share instead of buy, right? The sharing economy has kind of showed like maybe there's certain assets we don't need, and the self-driving cars are really what they claim to be. Maybe none of us will really have cars in the future. We'll see. The next kind of bucket of simplicity is mental simplicity. So Marissa already mentioned this. I think kids do this very well. Whether you're at the doctor's office, the beach, a mountain, your living room, if you're present and having fun with people you love, these are all as enjoyable. We actually don't need a lot to have joy. So there's a certain mental simplicity about being present and enjoying what's right in front of us. So I think living this simplistic life, one thing to also recognize is that as Christians, we actually need to kind of revolt, not necessarily in like a hard-fought revolution, but we need to actually recognize that most, if not all, advertising is a lie. For example, a handbag ad is not just telling you, oh, this handbag is nice. Handbags would never sell if that's all the advertising was saying. What a handbag ad is saying is, you need this handbag to be beautiful, loved, rich, important, or something, or noticed, or all of the above, right? And we know every single part of that claim is a lie. So I think we really have to bring that mode, that mindset of simplicity every time we're seeing an ad or feeling compelled to buy something. So in conclusion, the 5 spiritual disciplines we talked about today were slowing, service, silence, solitude, Sabbath, and simplicity. Again, we don't view these things as legalistic things, checklists to be done, or even ways to be a good Christian. These are disciplines, or what we would say ways of life that a disciple of Jesus would live, because this is how he lived. And I think deep down we all know that simply to believe in Jesus or to know him isn't enough to convince the world. Brennan Manning, author of the Ragamuffin Gospel, once said, "The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians. Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, but then deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable." And I think we all know this, right? We know that simply to believe in Jesus or obey him when we ask doesn't really show maybe such a radically different way of life that the world will notice. And so we know data, we know things about God, that convinces the head, and those are important. But stories and lifestyles change hearts. So the call today would be, let's live ways of life that make beautiful, heart-changing stories that the rest of the world can notice for God's glory. Thank you.